We're all joining the same Zoom, and so.
Okay, Odessa, can you mute while I do the introduction, please? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture at the University of the Underground. We are very, very happy and excited to welcome all of you here. The University of the Underground is a charity that was founded in February 2017. It is a free, pluralistic, and transnational university based in the basement of nightclubs. We have headquarters in Amsterdam and London, actively working with both institutions and nightlife. And as a charity, the hope of the University of the Underground is to bring generations together to democratize access to public institutions and trigger changes and critical reflections through the use of creative and experiential practices. Today, we are extremely blessed and fortunate to have Shuk Ying Chan joining us. Shuk Ying Chan is a Postdoctoral Prize Research Fellow at Nuffield College and the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. Her research sits at the intersection of 20th century anti-colonial thought, theories of global justice, questions of empire and race, and ideas of equality and self-determination. And with that, Ying, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Can you all hear me? Great. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I feel like for me, as an academic, it's really a privilege to be able to speak with you all artists and music producers on this topic. So I really look forward to the conversation and hearing your reactions to this material. Okay, so I sent out a handout. I hope that you might be able to, you might find it useful to look at it while I'm talking. You don't have to, but if anything's unclear, feel free to stop me at any time, but I'll try to speak for about 40 minutes and leave time for discussion. Okay, so just to start, let's begin with the kind of obvious fact that colonialism wasn't only an event of political domination and economic exploitation, but also crucially, it had a cultural aspect, and what we commonly call as cultural imperialism. So this long history of European domination over the so-called darker peoples of the world saw the destruction of many indigenous cultures around the world and the replacement of that culture with the culture of the dominant group. So a predominantly white Christian European culture. So this often happened historically under the heading of the civilizing mission, where the supposed superior Europeans were to spread their languages, knowledge, values, practices to the rest of the world in order to civilize them. Now, as we know, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, a wave of what historians call formal decolonization swept across the world. And people call it formal decolonization because it was mainly a process of colonial subjects attaining legal and formal independence from empires. But since then, the cultural legacies of European colonialism have continued to leave deep and long-lasting marks in our world today. The most obvious example is our widespread adoption of English. And since the rise of the US as also an extremely powerful and hegemonic power in global relations, there have also been worries about Western cultural influence through things like Hollywood and in general, Western cultural domination. So as we know, this has led to a lot of different kinds of campaigns and calls for decolonization to continue in the cultural sphere. Often these efforts have focused on recovering indigenous cultures that were destroyed in the era of European colonialism, whether that's indigenous art forms or indigenous philosophies, traditional knowledge, and so on. But these efforts have been criticized for being overly focused on what's authentically indigenous or authentically non-Western. And that is the efforts sometimes focus on recovering cultures that are untouched by the European colonial encounter, or that is produced by someone who is so-called authentically Asian or authentically African. Now, there are many problems of this kind of approach to cultural decolonization. We might call this approach the approach to recovering authenticity. I'm just going to briefly discuss 4 of these problems. And I am sure that some of them are quite intuitive to you. So the first is just that it's quite historically dubious or inaccurate to try and recover a sort of indigenous culture that remains uncontaminated by the sort of centuries and decades of imperial entanglement. Throughout the history of empire, colonizers and colonial subjects mutually shaped each other's cultures. So colonial subjects often even appropriated the colonizers' ideas and practices for their own use, sometimes even to subvert and challenge colonial rule, as we'll see in Aimé Césaire's case. So if we're focused on only retrieving and valuing a so-called uncontaminated indigenous culture, not only is this historically inaccurate, but also, as the philosopher Olufemi Taiwo has recently argued in his book Against Decolonization, it denies that the colonized had this agency where they appropriated Western or European practices in order to subvert and challenge colonial rule. So a second problem is that it's essentialist. So it's essentializing to suggest that we can draw a line between what's authentic and what's not based on the artist's social identity, right? The fact that the idea that if you are African, then what you produce is authentically African is essentializing. So that's the second problem. And then the third problem is that this kind of talk of what's an authentic non-Western national culture can easily lend itself to policing by the state or by dominant groups. So we think of, for example, the contemporary Chinese and Indian governments, which have tried to enforce a state-sanctioned version of Han Chinese or Hindu national cultures by repressing religious and ethnic minorities. Chinese government, to use a relatively silly example, recently criticized Christmas as an example of, quote, Western spiritual opium that endangers traditional Chinese culture, end quote. So the point is that, you know, when we talk about what is an authentically non-Western or indigenous culture, it risks the problem that the people who are in powerful positions, whether it's the state or a dominant group, might police the boundaries and repress dissenting or different voices. And then finally, again, Olufemi Taiwo makes this point very clearly in his book, this focus on authenticity can be constraining for post-colonial societies. So Taiwo argues that it encourages a comprehensive rejection of ideas and practices that are seen as tainted by their European origins. But some of these ideas and practices, if suitably reappropriated, might actually be beneficial and much needed. And so the emphasis on what's authentic or not constrains post-colonial writers and artists from actually being creative. Okay, so the emphasis on cultural decolonization as recovering authentic indigenous culture seems to be problematic, or at least it has these dangers. But what would a different kind of cultural decolonization look like? So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to propose that we look at Aimé Césaire and his sort of writings and political thoughts surrounding the problem of cultural imperialism and decolonization. So I'll just say a brief word about his biography for those of you who are not familiar with him. So Aimé Césaire was born in 1912 in Martinique, which was a French colony at the time. And he was educated first in Fort-de-France, and then in 1931, like many anti-colonial activists of his time, he went to the metropole to study. So he went to Paris in his case. There he met Léopold Senghor, who had also come from a French colony from Senegal. And Léopold Senghor would later become the first leader of independent Senegal. So the two of them in their student days were very, avid readers of African-American literature and poetry. This was a time of the Harlem Renaissance. And Senghor and Césaire theorized issues of race and identity together, wrote and published tons of poetry. And together with Suzanne Césaire and Léon Damas, they launched the Negritude movement, which was a cultural and political movement aimed at self-affirmation for Black peoples and African civilizations. Césaire, in 1945, went from being a poet to a politician. He was elected to the French National Assembly as a representative of Martinique. And in this role, he pushed for reforms to the empire that would transform it into a republic combined with legal and cultural pluralism. But these pushes for reform ultimately failed. And by 1955, 10 years later, Césaire became quite disillusioned. And in that year, he published his most famous book, Discourse on Colonialism, in which he compared French colonialism to Hitler's Nazism. Okay, so to understand his approach to cultural decolonization, we need to start with what he thinks of as culture. He defines culture quite broadly as, quote, the whole corpus of material and spiritual values created by society in the course of its history. And this includes all manner of things, elements as diverse as techniques and political institutions, things as fundamental as language or as fleeting as fashion, the arts as well as science and religion. So this is a very broad definition of culture. How should we make sense of it? We can think of culture as consisting of the practices, beliefs, and norms that a group develops when they share a set of formative conditions. And this is what the political theorist Alan Paton calls a culture. So these formative conditions may include a shared geographical environment, a shared history, including shared experiences of oppression, for example, political and economic systems, and so on. So individuals develop these practices and systems as a response to living under a particular set of formative conditions. As Césaire puts it, culture is like a fund of wisdom that comprises a whole intellectual equipment that members of a group draw upon in their daily life to solve collective problems. So this conception of culture is anti-essentialist. Instead of identifying any particular kind of content, instead, the idea is that culture is the accumulative result of a group's actions and creativity. Now, with this broad understanding of culture, let's now turn to Césaire's critique of cultural imperialism. I sent along, I don't know if you have time to read, but I sent along a speech by him called Man of Culture and His Responsibilities, unfortunately quite gendered language. So the following analysis is going to be built on that speech, and also another speech which I didn't send called Culture and Colonization, which if any of you are interested, feel free to email me, I can send it to you. So in these two speeches, Césaire famously argues that colonialism kills the creative power of the colonized. Wherever colonialism has existed, he argues, whole peoples have been deprived of their culture, deprived of all culture. So let's unpack this charge. For Césaire, different kinds of social and economic systems give rise to different kinds of culture, right? So people who share different kinds of economic systems will come up with different kinds of solutions to survive, and that means a different kind of culture. By replacing indigenous institutions and practices with European institutions, colonizers also destroy the indigenous cultures in that process. As he states, when the English destroy the state organization of the Ashantis in the Gold Coast, they also dealt a blow to Ashanti culture. But the main point of his critique is not about these cultural changes. As he argues, living cultures are dynamic. Inevitably, they constantly contain a mix of indigenous and foreign elements. In Discourse on Colonialism, Césaire argues that he's never advocated for a so-called return to the pre-colonial past. And he argues that culture, culture, exchange with other cultures is like oxygen. Without it, culture would just wither away. So instead, Césaire draws a distinction. There's a difference between borrowing and taking from foreign culture out of your own perceived need and having it imposed onto you. Césaire argues that borrowing from foreign cultures out of what he calls an interior state of mind that calls for it enables what was external to become internal. So the freedom to decide whether and to what extent to adopt elements from foreign cultures enables people to assimilate these elements in a way that doesn't disrupt the continuity of their culture as they see it. It enables them to retain what Césaire calls cultural harmony, a state in which heterogeneity is lived internally as homogeneity. Under colonialism, however, individuals are unable to freely appropriate different elements for their needs. Instead, he writes, foreign elements are dumped on the colonized soil, but remain foreign. White man's things, white man's manners, things existing alongside the native, but over which the native has no power, end quote. So on this critique, colonialism prevents people from exercising what we can call appropriative agency, the power to actively work through and independently assimilate external objects or foreign objects instead of passively accepting them. So this is what the philosopher Rahel Yegi calls appropriative agency. When people were forced to adopt the colonizer's culture, they experienced what Césaire calls cultural anarchy as opposed to harmony. According to Césaire, this is a situation in which different cultural elements are put together, juxtaposed, but not harmonized. So for example, French colonial education taught students the history of Europe and France instead of their own history. But this knowledge was not generally useful for them because their society and environment were shaped by very different historical factors. So on the one hand, colonizers created an artificial situation where students had to master a European curriculum in order to gain access to better opportunities and higher status. On the other hand, students living under European colonialism experience a very different reality. So we can say that students' knowledge of Europe and their lived experiences are juxtaposed, and that there's a stark division between the two. And one is not very useful for the other. So this kind of suppression of appropriative agency creates a deep sense of alienation. And that is the first problem that cultural imperialism creates, this pervasive sense that you have no power over what is being imposed on you. But there's also a second problem. So Césaire argues that colonialism creates a hierarchy of creator and consumer, whereby the creator of cultural values is the colonizer and the consumer is the colonized. So when indigenous cultures are destroyed and the colonizer's culture is given higher status, this reinforces a myth that some groups, namely non-European, non-white peoples, are incapable of producing anything valuable enough to be called culture. And instead they can only consume or at best react to the genius of others. So according to this familiar myth, colonized societies can only produce primitive cultures. And cultural progress requires imposition or assimilation into European culture. As Césaire puts it, time itself is divided in reference to colonization. Everything before colonization is so-called prehistory, and history only really begins with colonization. Under colonialism, existing forms of cultural production are relegated to the realm of the primitive. So African science, African philosophy, African history, he argues, all that becomes just folklore. And that is to say, debased literature, philosophy, and science, just as art itself becomes primitive art. So this hierarchy of creator and consumer exerts a real political power. On the one hand, it provides ideological justification for political domination and economic exploitation. On the other hand, it cultivates what Césaire calls an inferiority complex amongst colonial subjects, because their environment is saturated with reminders of European cultural dominance. They have to learn European languages, all they see is European art and literature and so on. So colonization, Césaire argues, quote, raises doubts regarding the concepts on which the colonized could build or rebuild their world, end quote. Colonized peoples come to believe that their own culture, having been stigmatized across decades and centuries as primitive, is unworthy as a source of value for modernity. Instead, they have to become European to progress. So this sows political division amongst colonial subjects and further undermines the prospect of resistance. Indigenous elites from the middle classes try to become European. and they end up being co-opted by colonizers. And so in this way, the potential of unified political resistance is undermined. Under colonial rule, indigenous elites were granted political and economic privileges in return for maintaining colonial order. These inequalities fostered alienation between indigenous elites and the people, and obscure the relation of subjection that they share to the colonizers. So, having internalized a cultural hierarchy, indigenous elites make every effort to learn and master European culture, and it considers itself different and superior to the colonial population. So in the face of cultural imperialism, Césaire argues that anti-colonial artists and writers have a really important responsibility. They have a responsibility to resist by making use of whatever little freedom and resources they have to make art, to write, tell stories. In other words, to engage in cultural production. This did not preclude appropriating the oppressor's culture for the aim of emancipation. For inspiration, he tells his fellow artists and writers to, quote, look at the Black novel, look at Black poetry, end quote. Due to transatlantic slavery and colonialism, the materials that African and African-American literatures drew upon were often, quote, disparate and heterogeneous. It was always a mixture of different cultures. Nonetheless, Césaire argues, these works were exemplars of writers and artists, quote, restoring order to the cultural chaos, end quote. In these works, Césaire states, quote, everything has been recast, everything has been transcended, everything is dominated and reconstructed, end quote. Now, what does this mean? Consider Césaire's own literary work as an example. Written in French, Césaire draws on European religions, symbols, historic events, but these elements from the colonizer's culture are assembled and structured in ways that express condemnation of colonialism and racial oppression. In other words, to appropriate foreign cultural elements is to, quote, bend them to my use, to reject, repurpose, or endorse at my will, end quote. So exercising agency in this way, insisting, as Edward Said, the post-colonial theorist, puts it, on a right to the community's history, to see the community's history as whole, coherent, and integrally, is important for overcoming alienation. So Césaire describes in an interview that his own art, the point of his own art is that while he's using as a point of departure the elements that French literature has given me, I've always striven to create a new language. I wanted to create an Antillean French, a Black French, end quote. So not only this cultural production helps overcome or alleviate alienation, but it's also a form of resistance. Césaire argues that colonial racial hierarchies can be undermined by indigenous cultural production. He argues that cultural production, quote, precisely because it is creation, disturbs the colonial hierarchy as it converts the colonized consumer into a creator, end quote. Césaire emphasizes cultural production as an example of what he calls the great power of the act, end quote. At the core of colonial oppression is the negation of the act, the negation of creation. Colonial subjects are seen as unable to create, and they're denied the freedom and resources to do so. So as a form of creative activity, cultural production challenges colonialism at its ideological core. It restores historic initiative to those whom it has been the mission of the colonial system to deprive, says Césaire. And in this way, it challenges the myth of racial inferiority. When members of the colonized population, such as Césaire and his colleagues, produce culture, the argument goes, this undermines the lie that they are inferior agents and ought to be put under European rule. And so in this sense, cultural production helps overcome this inferiority complex that Césaire was worried about. And so it's also important for restoring self-confidence. For many colonial, anti-colonial thinkers, a major task of decolonization was to cultivate this self-confidence. in order to resist colonial oppression, but also in order to create a democratic post-colonial society where former colonial subjects would remain assertive and confident guardians of their hard-won freedom. Cultural production, as Césaire argues, counterbalances the inferiority complex by demonstrating concretely to colonial subjects that individuals like them are equally capable of producing value. In doing this, Césaire argues that artists and writers are engineers of the soul, and in the last resort, inventors of the soul. So in this context of deep racialized oppression, artists' craft is also soul craft for the oppressed. Writers and artists give birth to a culture which organizes and sustains communal memory, as Edward Said says. But in order to do this work of overcoming inferiority complexes and restoring self-respect, not just any kind of cultural production will be able to do this. Césaire argues against top-down cultural production. He says that if we try to draw up a plan of future native culture by ourselves, this is not going to work. Instead, he argues that artists need to connect with the people and their reality. So one reason for this is that if cultural production is going to restore self-respect, the cultural producers can't be detached from the people. Their art must reflect people's everyday reality, to engage with their demands and their perspectives in order for people to see their own agency reflected in this art. Since colonial oppression was the most important reality that people faced at the time, Césaire argues that the responsibility of a so-called man of culture is to embody their efforts in the efforts of the colonized for liberation. Without being rooted in the lived experiences and perspectives of the people, cultural production would just result in art that is as irrelevant and alien as the colonizers. So Césaire warns against indigenous cultural elites producing or reproducing a cultural hierarchy that is similar to that of the European colonial hierarchy. So just to sum up here briefly before moving on, although Césaire was deeply concerned about the destruction of indigenous practices and ways of life under colonialism, he also argued that resisting colonialism wouldn't be a simple matter of trying to recover an authentically non-European pre-colonial culture. Instead, he argued that the problem of cultural imperialism is that it erases the agency of colonial subjects in producing valuable practices and in contributing to the betterment of humanity. Now, if that's the case, then what matters for cultural decolonization is the recentering of non-European agency in cultural and knowledge production. In other words, a reversal of this hierarchy of creator and consumer. So that, as Césaire argues, the historic initiative is restored to colonial subjects. So instead of being concerned with whether certain ideas or practices are authentically non-Western and policing the boundaries of indigenous culture, on this approach, and we can call this the agency approach, we focus on recovering the role of non-European actors in creating both Western and non-Western cultures, and empowering them to continue to exercise creative agency. So let's think about implications for cultural decolonization efforts today by breaking down this agency approach into two related parts: empowering and recovering the agency of historically oppressed groups. Now, first, on empowering agency. To empower someone is to help them build the capacity to do what they wish to do or to do what they have an interest in doing. So to empower individuals from historically oppressed groups to exercise their creative agency requires us to think about the constraints that makes it hard to do so. The most obvious constraint is lack of capital and access to new forms of technology. Since formal decolonization, post-colonial countries have been calling for the establishment of an international program of financial assistance and technology transfer to enable post-colonial countries to develop their media and cultural industries and communications infrastructure. As a matter of reparations for cultural destruction in the colonial era, former colonial powers have an especially strong duty of justice, as opposed to charity, to support these initiatives. But even with increased resources, it's not always the case that cultural producers can create whatever art they want, as I'm sure many of you know. In capitalist societies where media and cultural platforms are often commercialized and driven by profit making, cultural producers often face real pressures to shape their work in ways that cater to what's mainstream in the market. So part of cultural decolonization, if we want to empower creative agency of members of historically oppressed groups, needs to entail efforts to reverse commercialization of media and to revitalize public cultural platforms like public broadcasting, as well as support independent platforms that prioritize opportunities for people from these backgrounds. So in terms of recovering agency, this is to resist the ongoing and the past erasure of marginalized groups' creative agency. Now, this erasure happens in at least two ways. The first consists of dominant groups appropriating practices and ideas developed by marginalized groups. So this has a long history in European colonialism, where indigenous practices were appropriated and repackaged as European. This phenomenon continues to be found across music, fashion, cuisines, art, and so on today, but also in scientific research and most notoriously in drug discovery. So to give an example, in 2009, a French research institute patented a new anti-malaria drug without giving credit to the indigenous peoples of French Guiana, whom they had interviewed to discover the relevant plant. In another example, the French designer Isabelle Marant was criticized for plagiarizing textile patterns unique to the Purépecha community of Mexico. So in these instances, the appropriator, often white, from the dominant group, occupies the role of the innovator. While there might be an occasional nod to the marginalized group for having supplied so-called traditional materials for the innovation, the appropriator still receives most of the credit, including financial compensation and public recognition for their creativity. So a related but the different way in which the role of historically oppressed groups is erased is whitewashing. In the film industry, as some of you probably know, whitewashing refers to casting white people in roles that were written for people of color, usually leading to demeaning portrayals of people of color. So more broadly, we can take whitewashing to mean the outright erasure of contributions of historically oppressed groups from public memory and from historical narrative. Think of the history of American music, for example, from country to rock and roll. These cultural forms have been dominated by white artists and traditionally been seen as white Americans' creations. Only very recently have there been renewed efforts to recover and document the significant and foundational contributions made by African Americans in developing these musical genres. Even more broadly, whitewashing can be seen in former colonial powers' historical narratives about themselves, their own national identities. So living in the UK, for example, you know that the Second World War is a very sort of integral part of the UK's national identity. But until very recently, the role of soldiers from the empire in defending Britain has been erased from public memory. We can think of many more examples of whitewashing. Now, in order to counter these forms of erasure, there have been efforts from post-colonial countries as well as indigenous peoples to press for reforms to the intellectual property regime to give greater protections to traditional knowledge and cultural expressions to prevent these kinds of appropriation. This is not easy because intellectual property was developed in part to enable appropriation, European appropriation. It's an individualistic regime that doesn't recognize collective forms of artistic and knowledge creation. Second of all, to sort of resist erasure of historically oppressed groups from public memory, there have also been efforts to call on institutions that curate or shape that public memory, like museums and educators or education curricula, to prioritize recovering or recentering the roles of historically oppressed groups in shaping the many cultural genres and in contributing to making history as we know it today. So there are many more such initiatives that have similar potential. The broader point I want to make is that this approach to cultural decolonization emphasizes empowering people to exercise their agency and to be recognized for it. And it avoids the trappings of the approach to recover authentic culture. So if the point is to enable people to be creative, then it matters less whether the sources they draw from in their art are authentically indigenous or non-indigenous, Western or non-Western. Instead, what matters is that individuals have the freedom and resources they need to take from different sources and to create new art forms in accordance to their needs and to their desire, whether that's writing in Kikuyu as Ngugi wa Thiong'o chooses to do, or to reclaim French for his own purposes as Césaire has chosen to do. These are both different ways to exercise your creative agency and to use Césaire's language to assert one's presence in the world that denies that the colonized can be creators. Attempts to police the boundaries of a non-Western culture is just another way to prevent people from exercising that agency, and so actually hinders the process of cultural decolonization. So does this mean we should give up on recovering indigenous cultures? Definitely not. But it does mean that we should not take the question of what is authentically indigenous or non-Western as the primary focus of decolonial efforts. Instead, we can ask the question of what prevents former colonial subjects from exercising creative agency and to be recognized for it, and take that as a starting point to think about efforts to move towards a fairer and more equal post-colonial world. And I'll just stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. Let's go straight into some questions. Anyone in the room over there?
Actually, I have a question. On the topic of like cultural harmony, I just wanted to ask, like, is cultural visibility good? I'm just thinking like in situations where like, say, colonized groups get a lot of visibility and like it opens them up to like their newly decolonized culture being very increasingly like appropriated, and like what's the best way to like almost defend against that or like set boundaries to prevent the decolonized becoming colonized again?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think in a way that is sort of the heart of the question, right? So on the one hand, you don't want to be sort of invisible, right? You don't want your artistic creations to be invisible. And in part because, partly because I guess for artists like Césaire, and maybe some artists have different feelings about this, he sees himself as contributing to a sort of what he calls a universal humanism. So he sees the potential of the colonized because of their oppression in creating art forms that are genuinely sort of emancipatory or progressive and help sort of move the conversation sort of forward, right? A conversation about how we can live as human beings in relationships of equality, move past oppression. And he thinks that artists have that potential, or African artists in his case, have that potential to contribute to a conversation that he sees as happening at that sort of universal level. So you want to be visible in one sense, but on the other hand, you're very right that visibility comes with vulnerability, right? Especially if you're in a relatively powerless sort of position, and opens yourself up to appropriation. I mean, I don't have a very sort of like, set view on this, and I'd be interested to see what other people think. But I guess my sense is that some of these efforts to sort of provide some formal kinds of protection for indigenous cultures or indigenous knowledge is precisely responding to this, right? So for example, India has, the Indian government actually has compiled a database of all these traditional forms of knowledge that has come out of various sort of ethnic cultures in India, and that database has gotten sort of approved to as like a sort of legal tool. So anytime like a pharmaceutical company, for example, wants to make something with a certain ingredient or plant or whatever and want to patent it, they have to check this database, and if it's on there, they can't use that, they can't patent it, right? They have to sort of acknowledge, okay, this is actually not something we can claim exclusivity over. And in part because there was an effort to patent turmeric, and you know, obviously turmeric is something that's been used for, you know, millennia in many cultures, and so, you know, there are efforts like this that try to not you know, instead of privatizing traditional knowledge, it tries to make it so that it's still public and common knowledge and visible, but nonetheless, there is some protection in the sense that people can't just come in and say, hey, nobody owns this knowledge, so now it's mine. But yeah, it's very tricky. And I think that this goes, the deeper problem is the vulnerability that comes with being in relations of inequality, right? And so I think in order to have genuine cultural decolonization, you can't only focus on culture, you can't only focus on cultural production and cultural exchange. It has to be a comprehensive kind of transformation. It has to be economic, it has to be political, precisely because you're, you know, without changing those deeper power relations, even legal protections isn't going to take you that far at the end of the day. But yeah, really interested to hear if you have thoughts about this as well, or anyone else. Someone has written in chat, privatization of knowledge is a scary thought. Yeah, I mean, we do already privatize a lot of knowledge, unfortunately. You know, so yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's I think it's this is why I think it's important to see sort of decolonization as a much broader project than sort of you know, sort of recovering non-Western or pre-colonial forms of culture and knowledge. Because if we think about decolonization as, you know, sort of empowerment, right, and agency, freedom to exercise the agency, then immediately it becomes also a conversation about, well, how do you resist capitalism? How do you resist, you know, privatization of sort of, you know, cultural platforms that narrow that space for agency. Yeah. Any more questions, thoughts, or confusions? I said a lot of things that I don't know how much of it came across. I think I see a hand there. Sorry?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You could be, yeah.
Oh, okay. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed reading the Césaire text and the focus on creativity as a kind of tool for liberation. I was interested in, it seems to me that there's a kind of line between hybridity and cultural mixing as a tool for empowerment and appropriation as a tool of the colonized. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on where this line kind of ticks over and it stops becoming like Césaire using French as like empowering reappropriation for liberation, or where it becomes a tool of the colonizer and appropriating cultures again.
Yeah, again, great question. Yeah, so I think one way that I draw a distinction between the kind of appropriation that Césaire talks about and the kind that's problematic is precisely to look at the sort of relationship between the two groups, and, you know, to look at who is dominant, who is privileged, and who is not, right? So in a post-colonial, in a genuinely post-colonial world where there is equality, I think, you know, borrowing and taking from each other's cultures is just a good thing, right? It's just, you know, I agree with Césaire that, you know, this is the way to create a universal culture, a genuine genuinely universal culture. But in a world where there is deep inequality and, all these historic injustices are still unrectified, I think that whenever someone from a dominant group borrows from another culture, there has to be a lot of we can call them checks, right? So boxes to check, right? So consent is very minimal, right? So but it has to be an integral part of it. You have to sort of get consent from the group that you're borrowing from, some kind of authorization, but that is very minimal. It's the better thing to do would be, instead of appropriating, to be a collaborator, and a collaborator in a genuine sense of when you're working with someone who is less privileged than you, to kind of sort of center their creativity instead, right? So provide a platform for them to exercise their creativity and to be credited for it, and to receive both financial and compensation and public recognition for it. And so to provide almost like a facilitating kind of role, opening doors and that sort of thing, instead of you yourself kind of being the person that is seen as the innovator. And I think that this is we can think of this as an anti-racist practice. We can think of this as a decolonial practice. It's not enough on its own. It's never enough on the individual level, but it's something. It's something that I think would work against this sort of continued reinforcement of a hierarchy of who is a creator and who is a consumer. Now, when it comes to like people from marginalized groups appropriating from dominant groups, I think that's often fine. I mean, in fact, there's often no choice. Like I didn't have a choice to learn English. I think a lot of people don't have a choice to decide whether they are fluent in European cultures or philosophy or whatever, in order to be successful in their fields, right? And so in that sense, it's it has a very different moral status than the other case that we're concerned about. But yeah, it's a great question, and I think that it's something that we should all think about constantly, because we're all sort of privileged and in relation to someone else, right? So it's a good thing to be mindful about.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant answer. I like your focus on collaboration, because I think all too often it's kind of talked about as like, don't appropriate, but if we were to collaborate, then we can truly create new forms of culture. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, that's the hope, I guess. I mean, I'm interested to hear from you guys as well, your experiences as artists. I mean, what in your own work, like, does decolonization is that something ever comes up for you? Is that something that you think about? Yeah, if you have any thoughts to share or any other questions, that's also fine.
Hi, I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks so much for the talk. I found it really helpful. I think I've had a few practically speaking, I think I've had some challenges with just having, as a singer, an interest in like Tibetan throat singing, for example, or sort of like Algerian vocalization, and trying to kind of understand to what extent that those practices are things that I can integrate into my own, because they're more sort of more like practical things, and I don't know. I found it interesting to hear you talk about collaboration in that sense, and in that case, maybe perhaps not being centered, but yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, for example?
I wasn't entirely clear on sorry, if you would you mind clarifying? So you said that you have some trouble sort of integrating your own voice with others. Is that what you were saying? Or
no, for me it was more about specific singing practices that draw on like, for example, Tibetan throat singing was something I was thinking about, but then I was thinking about sort of my own legitimacy and using that in my own practice, and how to then actively sort of honor the cultures that it's come from and been developed through, by using it myself. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and Odessa or someone in that group has typed, right, I've ran into something similar with ball culture. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. And I mean, I think not being an artist myself, it's hard for me to provide like practical guidance, but I think in principle or ethically speaking, I think what I would do if I were you would be to try to embed myself in those communities where the art form comes from, and to communicate with artists from those communities, and to I think it's also enriching for your own work, but to see how they see your work, and and take it from there, almost, and in part because I think that often there can be this sort of worry that even with the most sort of like, even when we're trying to be most respectful, if there's no communication or genuine dialogue between you and the community where the art form is from, there's always the risk that you're doing something that is actually something that they find disrespectful or they find problematic, and so on. And so I, not to say that you are doing that, but I think that having as much as possible a genuine dialogue is I think would be a good place to start. But yeah, I mean, the other thing is, outside of your own work, I think we all are citizens of some place, or at least political actors, and sort of pushing those who have power, whether it's in politics or in your own industry, to sort of reform the kinds of to get rid of the constraints that make it difficult for people from these communities to create culture and create art themselves is ultimately, I think, the most important, right? So it's a longer term kind of thing. It's not like a thing that can be done in 1 day or 2 days, but it's definitely moving to transform the relationship that that makes that the kind of unjust structures that place you on a more advantageous position in relation to them, I think is ultimately the thing that we all have a duty to do, and the only thing that is going to move towards a world where we can appropriate from different cultures without worry. Yeah, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, not very helpful.
No, I thank you. Actually, I found it really, really helpful. And I think the like practical indications, like more concrete indications, were really great. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Any more thoughts, questions, musings?
I think we are coming to the end of it now, and like we probably won't have enough time to talk about it, but I found it really interesting how like you were talking about like combating the need for a purity of like an indigenous culture for it to be valid, as I find that's often like a very like strong talking point amongst like fascist ethnic groups or like ethno-fascist groups. And I thought like, especially in regards to like ethno-fascism, like what's like, are there any readings or anything we can do on like this sort of decolonial anti-ethno-fascism, I guess?
Yeah, lots. I'm happy to send, I mean, I guess I can send Tom some stuff and maybe he can be forwarded to you guys. But yeah, I mean, one really good book that I read recently, which I also mentioned in the talk, is, I just type it, it's called Against Decolonization, which, might sound a bit provocative. I mean, he's not actually against decolonization, and there are things in there that I don't agree with, but you can judge for yourself. But he makes a really good critique of this kind of ethno-cultural nationalism, I guess, or this kind of confusing decolonial politics with a kind of policing the boundaries of what's authentic. And particularly he's writing about African philosophy, where I guess some African philosophers have focused on basically getting rid of any kind of ideas that are inherited from the Enlightenment. And that's a very difficult project. And also, yes, as Taiwo argues, you know, kind of creates all sorts of sort of delegitimizes a lot of people that should actually be legitimate interlocutors in the conversation. But yeah, I mean, beyond that, like there are other readings I can recommend as well. So I'll just send a list over if you're interested.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we are coming to an end now. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the lecture. Thank you everybody for the questions. Stay in the room. We are moving on to another lecture right now, but first of all, let's just show our thanks to Ying, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ying.
Thank you. You're very welcome, and good luck with all of your work and the program. Bye.
Bye.